Optional is one area which is mostly being ignored by the students. And if we'll talk about the optional paper, which is of just 500 mark, but then what is the possibility of scoring, right? The possibility is roughly around, I believe, 270, right? 280. When it comes to the UPSC preparation, at that point of time, most of the aspirants focus more on what? Like on general studies. एक साल तो मैंने देखा था कि 23 questions history से आए थे, and those were precisely from history. When should you start your preparation? And I believe that it is one of the biggest strategic mistake what the students mostly commit while dealing with the optional paper. आपसे मैं एक जनरल सवाल पूछता हूँ कि जब आप जीएस प्रिपेयर करते हैं उस समय आप कितना कॉन्फिडेंट होते हैं, और जब ऑप्शनल प्रिपेयर करते हैं तो आप कितना कॉन्फिडेंट होते हैं? इफ योर कॉन्सेप्ट्स आर साउंड, इन दैट केस लाइक एनी सॉर्ट ऑफ क्वेश्चन व्हिच इज कमिंग, जिसको मैं यूजुअली बाउंसर क्वेश्चंस बुलाता हूँ, अगर वो बाउंसर क्वेश्चंस भी आते हैं तो आप उसको हैंडल करने की हालत में होंगे। हेलो ऑल, दिस इज पीयूष। आज की वीडियो में हम बहुत खास बात करने वाले हैं, एंड दिस इज लाइक विद रिस्पेक्ट टू द ऑप्शनल पेपर. As you all understand, in the UPSC curriculum, at one hand general studies is there, on the other hand you find the optional paper. Sometimes what I have realized that optional is one area which is mostly being ignored by the students, and that ignorance is at multiple level, right? So in this particular session we are precisely going to discuss about the real weightage of the optional paper, and then some more things like some more strategic things for the optional paper. So when it comes to the optional paper, right, since I have been teaching and mentoring the history optional, and that's why I would be talking about history optional, but then frankly speaking, it is applicable to most of the optional papers, right? What I have realized that when it comes to the UPSC preparation, at that point of time, most of the aspirants focus more on what? Like on general studies. मुझे पता नहीं क्यों लगता है कि जनरल स्टडीज का एक हवा है या एक ट्रेंड है, एक फैशन है, जहाँ पे आप देखेंगे कि जो है लोग जनरल स्टडीज के बारे में मतलब दे आर वेरी मच डेडिकेटेड टू द जनरल स्टडीज, एंड दे समहाउ टेक ऑप्शनल पेपर very lightly. But UPSC is always about the strategy. If you are really capable of making the right strategy, like in that case, like that journey would be easy. And probably when it comes to that strategy, where optional has to play a very important role. So let us try to understand this thing first logically. So if we'll see the optional paper, right, in that case mostly we believe that optional is just of 500 marks. I think there are two ways in which we can see it. The first, when you compare your marks with general studies, in that case, what is the possibility of marks in general studies? Like, let's say if you have been scoring 400 out of 1000, that is considered to be a very decent score, right? Frankly speaking, if you have been crossing 400, let's say 420, 425, 430, that is considered to be a super score in general studies. People have been crossing 450 also, but then this is rare case, and I'm not taking like the exceptional cases. I'm just talking about in general. So 400 is considered to be quite a decent mark, and in fact for selection 400 marks is good enough. Fine. My point is that out of 1000, if you have been scoring 400, that is considered to be quite a decent mark. On the other hand, if we'll talk about the optional paper, which is of just 500 mark, but then what is the possibility of scoring, right? The possibility is roughly around, I believe, 270, right? 280. Again, I have been taking a very sort of generalistic mark, right? It is quite possible, and many of the students are crossing 300 also. But then as I'm telling you that I am showing you the average picture rather than a sort of exceptional picture, fine? So out of 500, 270, 280. On the other hand, out of 1000, 400. So what is the point to be noted here? There is greater weightage of optional paper. So, and in fact, one more thing that you should keep in mind, that here you do not have a defined syllabus. Here you have a proper defined syllabus, right? That also something which is making it very important, because when you have a defined syllabus, when you have a limited syllabus, at that point of time, scoring these many marks would be easier for you as compared to general studies, which is very much dynamic. And in fact, regular updation is very much needed in this particular part. So this is one thing that you should always, or this comparison you should always keep in mind. अगर इस comparison को ध्यान में नहीं रखते हैं, then there would be a problem with your strategy. On the other hand, GS में भी अगर आप देखेंगे तो कहने को हर सब ऑप्शनल पेपर की कुछ ना कुछ यूटिलिटी होती है, हिस्ट्री की भी काफी यूटिलिटी है एज फार एज द जीएस पार्ट इज कंसर्न. सो यू कांट सी दैट ऑप्शनल पेपर ओनली विथ रेस्पेक्ट टू दिस 500 मार्क, rather you should see with respect to other areas also. Let's say if you talk about the pre-exam, so I roughly believe ki 30 to 45 marks question, 45 marks questions are coming in the pre-examination, right? And in fact, I don't believe I have given you the range. Why? because hardly matters that some year like there are lesser questions, some are more questions. एक साल तो मैंने देखा था कि 23 questions history से आए थे, and those were precisely from history. I'm just talking about those areas, right? So कम से कम 40 नंबर ऑन एन एवरेज आप मान के चल सकते हैं कि 40 नंबर की you are getting the help of 40 marks from history itself. And undoubtedly if you have that history optional, in that case you'll feel somehow comfortable as compared to the other aspirants. And sometimes I have noticed very conceptual questions are coming. Okay, apart from that, if you'll go to mains, right, if you'll go to the mains, in that case that just GS paper 1, in GS paper 1 roughly around 90 marks questions are coming from history. And again I have been talking about those questions which are directly from history, right? Now there are so many questions coming on society, then coming precisely I'll say society, because day by day the importance of society is increasing, and society and then Indian society and all, right, it's increasing. And in fact, whenever you have been attempting the questions from the Indian society, trust me, a historical background would always help you to write the answers. I'm not counting those things. Okay, let's say you have been writing about communalism. So if you have been writing about communalism, so without having that historical background of the communalism, you won't be able to do the right justice to the answer. And that's the reason in other areas also it is helping, but then I'm not counting that. Frankly, directly at least 90 mark questions are coming from this part. Apart from this, I must say the history is quite helpful in GS paper 4, right? It is very, very helpful in GS paper 4. In fact, since you study the post independence, and this is one of the areas which have become quite important these days, so you can find that it is having application in paper 2, then paper 3, and in paper 4 as well. You can find that the thinkers that you study specifically in the world segment, specifically in the modern India, such as either it is about Buddha, even in ancient India Buddha is there, Mahavir is there, Kautilya is there. Then you can talk about certain thinkers or certain philosophers from the Western world. So basically you can find that there are so many thinkers that you study in history, and you understand the relevance of those thinkers, which are very much applicable in GS paper 4 also. Even in the essay paper you can find some utility of this history as a subject. Now it's not necessary that whether directly any essay topic is being given from history or not. Whenever you have studied history, right, whenever you have studied history, now trust me, it is always helping you to write anecdotes, the right stories, and the so many examples for quoting in the essay paper. So somehow that makes or gets the weightage in your essay, because if you have been really referring, or if you are really including some real examples from the history, in that case there is more reliability, there's more acceptance of these kind of examples. So in essay also this is quite helpful, but I'm not counting those things. So if you'll really club all of them, in that case you'll find that there is greatest weightage of this particular subject. So that you should always keep in mind. So in terms of marks, you should be very clear that when you have been taking optional, you should actually go for these kind of comparisons, these kind of permutation combinations, that how you can score or how you can utilize this particular subject for scoring maximum, not only in this particular side or in the optional side, but even in the other areas also. That's the USP of the subject. Fine. Moving to the next question, which is also very important with respect to the subject. And what is it? When should you start your preparation? Now this is something which is somehow a very important question, and I believe that it is one of the biggest strategic mistake what the students mostly commit while dealing with the optional paper. I must tell you that it is applicable to the applicable to most of the optional papers as well as history also, right? So when it comes to the right time for starting the optional paper, so normally what trend I have noticed with the students believe, right, students believe that optional is something that can be, since it is having a sort of narrow syllabus as compared to GS, and that's how it should be covered later. And that's how I have noticed that majority of the students their first preference is to do the coaching of the GS, and the second preference is the optional. I believe it is one of the biggest strategic mistake or the failure. Optional is undoubtedly consuming roughly around 5 to 6 months, and in fact for that matter if we'll talk about any optional paper it's consuming 5 to 6 months. So optional के को लेके जो ये टेंडेंसी होती है कि बाद में कर लेंगे, 5-6 महीने ही तो लगते हैं, GS में 1 साल लगता है, I think that is something which can be considered as a wrong strategy, right? आपसे मैं एक जनरल सवाल पूछता हूं कि जब आप जीएस प्रिपेयर करते हैं उस समय आप कितना कॉन्फिडेंट होते हैं, और जब ऑप्शनल प्रिपेयर करते हैं तो आप कितना कॉन्फिडेंट होते हैं? Undoubtedly if you are really serious, in that case while preparing for the optional you might feel more confident, and नाउ दैट वुड हेल्प यू इन मल्टीपल वेज। जब आप जीएस प्रिपेयर करते हैं तो आपके दिमाग में बहुत सारे क्वेश्चंस होते हैं, बिकॉज जीएस डायनामिक है नेचर में, एंड सिंस जीएस डायनामिक है नेचर में, इसीलिए उसमें लगातार इंटीग्रेशन बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। मतलब फ्रॉम द करंट अफेयर्स यू नीड टू इंटीग्रेट द थिंग, एंड इनफैक्ट हाउ efficiently you are able to connect it with the current examples, the current developments. Now that would somehow help you to excel in the GS paper. But when it comes to optional, you should always keep in mind that optional is something which is static. So basically, as I did tell you, that optional does require how many months? 5 to 6 months. But then these 5 and 6 months are not they are not somehow completing your preparation. आपको हमेशा ध्यान में रखनी चाहिए कि 5 से 6 महीने आपको सिलेबस खत्म करने में लगता है, और उस 5-6 महीने के बाद देयर इज समथिंग व्हिच मेक्स व्हिच इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, एंड व्हाट इज इट? दैट इज कंसोलिडेशन, राइट? दैट यू फर्स्ट कंसोलिडेट योर इंफॉर्मेशन और द कंटेंट. Now it is also important that if you are capable, then minimize it, and then that comes to the last thing, and that is what? That is answer writing. So how much information you do have, that's not very important. Whether you are able to reproduce them in your answer, that is the most important thing. And if you believe that coming from any background, one day you'll get into the examination and you'll do it, I think this is one of the biggest mistakes. I can give you my example, because since I had studied history, I was writing UPSC at that point of time. I was already in MPhil, so I completed graduation, masters, MPhil, right? So I was believing I'm very confident, right? So I'll be able to handle anything. I'll be able to manage everything, right? So I never did good amount of practice of answer writing, and then I went to the examination. Now problem was this, ki I had the overload of information, right? So when I started writing answers, at that point of time, the answers were becoming somehow bigger, and I was not able to confine them in the limited space and the limited time. ठीक है, हमारे टाइम पे एक ये भी चीज थी कि पेपर आपको अलग से भी मिलते थे, एक्स्ट्रा सीट्स मिलते थे, तो वो लिमिटेशन नहीं थी कि आपको इतने में आंसर खत्म करना है. तो somehow you are writing an answer and then it's getting stretched a lot. So ultimately you have to suffer in the rest of the question. So that's the reason, because of what answer writing in the optional, precisely it is an art, so that you need to learn. So I believe that when it comes to optional paper, right, so you should not take it lightly कि ठीक है इसको बाद में कर लेंगे, क्योंकि actually it is a process. As you can see, these 5 and 6 months, then this process and then this process, so it is going to consume the time. Now as I told you that the syllabus of the subject is static, and in fact when it comes to history optional, somehow it is more static as compared to the other paper, and it is one of the beauties of the subject, right, that it is somehow more static. Now if you have been dealing with such kind of subjects, in that case what is going to happen? You should always keep in mind that once you have done it, and then along with your GS you go for regular you go for regular answer writing, consolidation, right, and then memorizing all these things. So somehow along with the GS, just by giving 2 to 3 hours, you can do all these things, and somehow you'll start getting that confidence gradually, and that would somehow help in the examination. No, my optional is ready, so at least in the optional I'm going to score 270 or 280. This confidence would somehow help you in the other areas also. This is the beauty of this, and that's why I believe that don't wait for time, that ठीक है हम शुरू करेंगे, बाद में करेंगे, पहले थोड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट एरियाज जीएस के कवर कर लेते हैं, उसके बाद हम ऑप्शनल को देखेंगे. That approach is I believe it is incorrect. So I believe this is the right time, because now it is April. So let's say if you have been starting from April, in that case I believe by month of December somehow will be completely done with your optional paper. आपके पास वो पूरा कॉन्फिडेंस होगा कि यार मैंने सब कुछ कर लिया है, कंसोलिडेशन, नोट्स मेकिंग, राइट, एंड देन आंसर राइटिंग, आई हैव डन एवरीथिंग, each and everything. So that would somehow bring great amount of confidence in you. So that's something which is really important in your preparation. Fine. Moving to the next thing, as you all know that from 30th of March, we are going to begin the next history optional foundation. Now this optional foundation is really important, and in fact this is also something, though it is not the prime issue of the discussion, that whether you should join coaching or not, that is subjective, that is depending up to you. But then from 30th of March I believe that you must join, because it is helping you in multiple regards, because it is minimizing your efforts, and that to a greater extent if the things are there in a compiled manner. And in fact in my class this is what I try, because there are few things that you need to keep in mind, that when it comes to optional paper, understanding should be very clear, that understanding should be supported by the decent amount of content, right, and then historiography. And if you club all of them, somehow your job is completed. So as I told you that I emphasize on these kind of things. So first of all, as I did tell you that it consumes how much time? 5 months, right? So in these 5 months, I am going to cover it in a very systematic manner. And in fact, in a defined the syllabus, defined syllabus would be covered in a defined timeline. It would be covered, right? That is one thing. The second thing, conceptual and analytical approach. Now this is something which has become quite important these days in the optional papers. Specifically in the history optional papers, I have realized that now questions are coming in a very conceptual manner, and that's why somehow it is very much important that your concepts are very sound. Because if your concepts are sound, in that case any sort of question which is coming, जिसको मैं यूजुअली बाउंसर क्वेश्चंस बुलाता हूं, अगर वो बाउंसर क्वेश्चंस भी आते हैं तो आप उसको हैंडल करने की हालत में होंगे। और उससे भी जरूरी जो चीज मुझे समझ में आती है, अगर आप कॉन्सेप्चुअली साउंड है तो फिर आप इंटरलिंकेजेस करने के लिए कैपेबल है, ठीक है, आप क्वेश्चंस को मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंटली समझने के लिए कैपेबल है। बिकॉज आई हैव रियलाइज that majority of the students are not even able to decode the question properly, understand the right demand of the question properly. So you won't be doing all these mistakes, and that's why I focus a lot on this. So there are 5 standard reference material that would be provided to you, and in fact along with the classes there'll be more than sufficient. You don't need to read anything, and it's not very bulky. It's not very bulky because I believe that the minimum content is something which is very much needed, because you can't expand yourself too much, right? And then regular test would be there, and then of course regular doubt clearing sessions would be there. So all these things would be very much part of this optional paper, or this these classes. So as I told you that it is going to start from 30th of March. If you are really interested, in that case definitely you can join it. So you're most welcome. Thank you very much.